Should you tell a narcissist that he's a narcissist? I want to talk to you today about how that could have repercussions for you and how it might not be the best idea. But then what do you actually do if this person's struggling with narcissism or narcissistic tendencies? Otherwise, it seems like it's just like the end all and you're not able to do anything to be able to help this person. Well, we're going to talk about that some today, and I want to be able to give a perspective from my perspective. And if you're new here, my name is Ben Taylor. I'm a self-aware narcissist on this channel to provide awareness of narcissistic abuse. I set people free from narcissistic abuse, from the trauma bond, from the rumination, from the intrusive thoughts, from the things that are keeping you captive and stuck to a toxic person. If I can help out at all today, please go to rawmotivations.com or start one of your journeys with us inside of the challenges that we provide. One of them being clarity challenge. Get clarity and understanding about this current situation that you're in. Now, you might be tempted if you figure out and you realize and you see these narcissistic tendencies in your partner that, hey, I need to go ahead and tell this person. I want to caution you for a moment about this, and we're going to dive into it to have you understand, but sometimes there's different repercussions that might happen, and you might be debating, is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea? What's actually going to happen? One of the things that is one of the most difficult things for narcissists to get to is having this piece of self-reflection. Actually seeing and understanding the problem or the issue for what it actually is and for what they've actually done or how they've caused different things to happen in the relationship. So like for me, I didn't want to acknowledge anything at all that I did wrong. I could acknowledge what other people did wrong and I could acknowledge other things that happened, but not necessarily something that was going to point back at myself showing, oh, I did something wrong. When you tell a narcissist, I think you're a narcissist, it's oftentimes going to spark this defensiveness rather than self-reflection. So you might be thinking, hey, if I bring this up, maybe then he'll realize it, maybe then he'll work on it, maybe then he'll start to process this and we can actually move forward. However, the majority of the time, that's not the case. So whenever my wife brought up that I was narcissistic, and then whenever she brought up that, hey, this might be what you struggle with or what's going on, I was immediately defensive. I was immediately aggressive. And then also I was gaslighting. I was changing the story and the reality that she was currently experiencing to make her believe and understand that she was the crazy one and that it wasn't me. Because I couldn't be the narcissistic one. I couldn't be the abusive one. It couldn't be my fault. So I had to change it. I had to change my story. I had to change her story. I had to convince her and other people that I wasn't narcissistic to make sure that I kept up with the lie that I was a good person and wasn't the person that she was painting me out to be. Now, when you talk about narcissism, it's characterized by this lack of self-awareness. Now, it's not a diagnosable trait, and it's not part of the 9 diagnostic traits inside the DSM-5 about NPD, okay? But understanding the majority of time, they're not looking at themselves. It's always at something else. Someone else's fault, someone else's problem, not taking accountability and responsibility for the thing that they did. Okay? This is typically why you run into issues where you're trying to convince them that they're narcissistic, or you're trying to convince them that they're abusive, or you're trying to convince them that they're emotionally manipulating you and they're unwilling to see it and they're unwilling to work through it. This is because if they did, they would have to acknowledge their own behavior. They would have to be accountable. So for me, I wanted to do anything and everything to not be accountable for the issues that I was doing. Why? Because if I did, that would produce this level of guilt. That would produce this level of shame. That would produce this level of stuff that says, hey, I'm not as good as what I think I was. And so when that would happen, I would get defensive, I would get mad, I would get angry, I would stonewall, like I would kind of move away and be like, okay, forget this. Like I'm gonna move aside, I'm just gonna do what I want to do, forget you. And this happens so oftentimes in narcissistic relationships where there's this inability or unwillingness to actually be accountable or responsible for the things that have happened. Did this happen to you? Because we see this trend happen so many times in narcissistic relationships where you're trying to hold him accountable or say, hey, I think this is what's going on, and you're not able to get anywhere. Okay, so when you point out narcissistic tendencies or narcissism in your partner, it may trigger this defensiveness. It may lead to denial, lead to anger, lead to manipulation, and also could lead to it impending on your safety. So please be careful. Think of it this way. You have a partner and he's been displaying narcissistic traits for a long period of time. He's been excessively self-centered. He has no empathy. He's cheated on you. There's like multiple things that you're just like, something seems off. And as you start to dive into narcissism and the narcissistic traits, you start to see more and more of a connection point of this seems to match up. The problem is when you bring it up, when you start to attempt to address the issues, address everything's going on, and even suggest, I think you might be a narcissist, or it might be something we want to look into, he responds with overreacting anger. Accuses you of overreacting, accuses you of being oversensitive, accuses you of just applying labels, says like, you don't have the right to be able to say that about me. You're not a doctor. You can't diagnose me. All these different things to try to be able to shift the blame off of his actions. What is actually being demonstrated. The evidence that you bring to the table oftentimes gets discounted. Well, you can't see that. You don't understand. You don't, and everything gets turned around versus any self-reflection of being like, wait a second, do I actually act this way? Do I actually show up this way? Narcissist doesn't like to do that. Just likes to push the blame onto someone else. Then oftentimes it turns into escalation. Now, I've mentioned like defensiveness. I've mentioned like the aspect of getting angry, 100%. But then oftentimes it turns into escalation and even retaliation back onto you. Like you'll see conflicts that start to ramp up in their intensity. You'll see conflicts start to ramp up in their frequency. And all of a sudden you see this happen more and more and more because you're starting to catch on to his tactics. You're starting to catch on to the cycle that's happening inside the relationship. You see, narcissists see criticism as being a threat to themselves, a threat to their fragile self-ego and esteem, a threat to anything that actually works on disproving the mask that they've worked on creating. So like, I've created this mask, right? Like I created this mask of I'm a good person. Even though I was cheating on my wife, I'm a good person. So I show up with this mask all the time. So then when something happens, or when she brings up something of like, hey, I think you're narcissistic, I think you struggle with this, that's actually attacking the mask. That's putting me in a quote unquote unsafe place because it's no longer safe believing the reality that I manufactured to make me feel better about myself. It might sound kind of weird because you don't live in this current frame or this idea, but I'm just trying to break it down so you understand. Like in the narcissist mind, it's like, hey, I'm not safe because I'm going to deal with guilt and shame because that goes against who I actually am, thinking in their mind, this mask that they've created, and I don't want to be that, so I'm going to create this mask. Wait, this mask is going to get blown apart because this person's actually seeing me who I actually am. I'm in trouble. Like, this is something that I need to protect myself from, this attack. See, it all gets twisted around in the narcissist's mind, making them feel and think that they're justified in retaliating back on you and getting upset, getting mad, and coming back on you because it's your fault. It's not their fault, right? Have you feel that it's their fault? Did you have this happen? Was this something that you saw in your relationship where he was very, very against any possibility of it being his fault because it was a threat and had to be able to come back and attack you? Now, when they see this criticism, this threat against the ego, against the esteem, a lot of times it'll keep escalating into heightened hostility, emotional manipulation, all these different pieces, and it begins to intensify the emotional turmoil that's happening inside the relationship and intensify like what could actually transpire between you and that person. So part of this is to say like, hey, you need to be very, very careful because when you bring this up, we've seen it escalate into physical violence. We've seen it escalate into you getting kicked out on the street. We've seen it escalate in multiple ways. Like you confront somebody about their behavior, and instead of acknowledging it, just intensifies and gets worse and worse and worse. Maybe even starts a smear campaign. Maybe even starts to show other people like, oh, this person's crazy. Like all these things to blame and project things onto you. Now, the last thing I want to point out is you need to understand that it's very, very unlikely for a narcissist to change. That's just not really on the boards of a narcissist actually seeing the light of day and saying, oh, I'm going to change. Now, the reason why is because of all of these levels of lies, of things that the narcissist has put in between them and the truth to quote unquote protect themselves from that criticism, from that piece of shame. Okay, so narcissists are very, very resistant to change. Feels like death, feels like vulnerability is weakness. It feels like all these things are going to attack them. So they can't do that. They have to run away from it. Okay. Now, believing that when they run away from it, when they're abusive, when they're protecting themselves, again, from this perspective, they believe that the behavior is justified and they're above reproach. Like, hey, it's okay that I did this because I had to do this. So as a result, they hardly ever seek any professional help. They hardly ever genuinely commit to true transformational growth and work on themselves. Okay. Even if narcissism is pointed out and they start to realize or recognize this is the problem. Okay. Majority of narcissists are unwilling to engage in the truth. So as a result, they typically will not change. If your narcissist is not willing to engage in the truth and the honest facts of the situation, then do not hold out on him to change, because the majority of the time it will not happen because he's unwilling to be honest. If you don't have a person in your life who's honest, who's vulnerable, and is showing up consistently working on their changing of their lives, you don't really have much of a relationship. If you don't have someone who's honest and transparent with you, you don't know what type of relationship you even have. So please be careful about that. Hopefully this has been helpful today. I want just the last thing I'll leave you with is, if you think, hey, I really just want to tell him, like I think he doesn't get it. If he knew this, then start with something simple. Let's just start with how he talks to you. Let's just start with the lies that he says to you. Let's just start with something small. And the thing you have to realize is, if you can't get on the same page and work through this piece of like honesty, or work through how communication's happening, or work through these small problems, you're not going to be able to convince him that there's bigger problems that's actually going on. And so you have to be able to start small and to be able to even get to the place where you could bring up narcissism. If you just bring up narcissism and there's no history of him being willing to self-reflect and see anything that's wrong with himself, you're not going to get anywhere. Please be safe. Please be careful. Remember, there's no excuse for narcissistic abuse. Please reach out for help.